All right, Psalm 35, let's call this one Pray to Rejoice for the Right Reasons. In this psalm where David simply seems fed up because, as we mentioned before, there seems to be a pattern over most of these 7 psalms, or the 7 psalms we look at this week, that starts off with David offering praise, then an observation in the form of a reflection on why he's praising, and a request or something he's asking for based upon the way that God has come through for him in the past. But this time he is going to dispense with the preamble in the praise and the recall, and he's getting straight into asking in verse 1. Contend, O Lord, with those who contend with me. As we said, David seems fed up. We're going to skip down to verse 7, though, because that is going to seem to be where the recall kicks in, where he says, for without cause they hid their net for me. He's going to go back to the request in verse 8, it seems, where he says, let destruction come upon him when he does not know it. And he is then going to kick in with the praise in verse 9. Then my soul will rejoice in the Lord, exulting in his salvation. Skipping a phrase in verse 10, he'll pick up again, roughly saying, O Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong for him, the poor and needy from him who robs him. A place where he is then going to seem to go back to the recall where he says, malicious witnesses rise up and ask him things he does not know. Even more, they repay him evil for good, as he recalls when they were sick, he mourned for them as though he was mourning for close family. But verse 15 is going to say, but at my stumbling, they rejoiced, leading into what seems to be David's final request that's going to go through most of the chapter, quite possibly on to the final verse, where he's going to pick up the praise again and say in, I think, verse 28, then my tongue shall tell of your righteousness and of your praise all the day long. But when David recalls the way in which they have rejoiced at his stumbling, it is going to help set off at least 3 times in his final request to God that God not let his enemies rejoice over him. Verse 19, let not those rejoice over me who are wrongfully my foes, and let not those wink the eye who hate me without cause. And again in verse 24, vindicate me, O Lord, my God, according to your righteousness, and let them not rejoice over me. And again in verse 26, let them be put to shame and disappointed altogether who rejoice at my calamity. All possibly seeming to sum up at the end of verse 26, where he says, let them be clothed with shame and dishonor who magnify themselves against me, reminding me of a quote we pulled from an atheist, actually, by the name of Will Durant, who actually studied the life of Christ, even though he didn't believe that Christ was the Son of God. And he said something not necessarily related to his study of Christ as a historical figure that caught my attention when he observed, speaking ill of others is a dishonest way of praising ourselves. A quote we've used in previous Psalms that reminded me of what David is saying in this chapter. He is struggling with people who are looking beyond all of the good things that David has done to find joy in his flaws. Not simply to find his flaws, but, as he's saying here, in a way that seems to magnify themselves against the picture of David that they would like to create, which reminded me of 2 things that are not so much new lessons as much as they might simply be reminders. And that is, in my own life, to the degree I fixate on anything, I can become naturally blinded to the larger picture of life around me. And so in this circumstance, to the degree that my self-esteem becomes contingent on the faults I can find in others, I begin to forget that the same way I sift through their successes to find their flaws sets up the same kind of standard that God may apply to me, sifting through my successes to magnify my flaws. Understanding that the other thing this chapter reminded me of, for whatever reason, is as older middle-aged men, we are under a lot of pressure not to look thirsty. Why? Because it's a horrible look, otherwise known as visible lust. And even though I may never fully understand how horrible a look it is from the female perspective, I have unfortunately gotten a chance to see how horrible a look it is when we begin to visibly lust for the failure of those around us. And for that reason, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that God deliver us from the temptation for our self-esteem to be rooted in the failure of others, but that he also guide us into the ability to rejoice for the right reason.